Okay.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tuesday, January 1st, 2023 iteration of the Kubernetes SIG-Windows community meeting. As always, these meetings are recorded and uploaded to YouTube, so be sure to adhere to the CNCF Code of Conduct. Let's get started with some announcements. First announcement is 127 release is officially started. Yesterday was the first day of the release cycle. And enhancements freeze is probably the next major milestone. That is on Thursday, February 9th. So work on getting all those in, and then hopefully all the code PRs in after that. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to announce? Nope. Okay. Next is, as always, we'll see if there's any new contributors that want to give either an introduction or just say hi, what you're working on, ask any questions. So if there's anybody new here, feel free to unmute, raise your hand, and I'll let you introduce yourself. All right, doesn't look like it. There's a couple things on the agenda. If anybody has anything else, feel free to add it. The first agenda item, you want to click on that, James, is something that I wanted to discuss in a more public forum or bring attention to it rather than just in this PR. But so this change is proposing using a different way to calculate the memory that's being reported by the node stats. And I wanted to just start a more public discussion on this. My initial thoughts are that I don't think we want to change how the kubelet's reporting memory stats, at least not without some sort of a feature gate or a way to progress it over, just because these types of changes also often are surprising to people, no matter how much we say it's changing or documenting why. And I'm more inclined to suggest that they use something like Windows Node Exporter if they need to get these stats, unless there's a very good reason to have the kubelet report these stats. But I'm definitely wanting to start a discussion on this. I know, James, you've been doing some work with the CRI based stats. You might have some opinions. But yeah, anybody feel free to comment. And I also asked, I was hoping Brendan and somebody more from the Windows Container Platform, like internals team, could also comment too, just to make sure we're doing the calculations correctly or reporting what we're actually thinking.
Yeah, so is this, I guess what I don't know is, they're just expecting a different value? Particularly like the way that memory is, and we're reporting the right thing, but there's also another metric that they're particularly interested in that shows a slightly different viewpoint on all of that.
My take on it is that there is not a right, and like both what we are currently reporting and what this individual would like to be reported could be considered correct based on how memory works differently for Windows and Linux in most cases, and what the field meant on Linux. There's no exact equivalent.
Yeah, I guess if it's that second one where it's like just a different viewpoint, then maybe either a new metric or using a tool like Node Exporter to get something that makes more sense. That's kind of my thought.
Because on Windows, it's like your physical memory usage does not actually indicate that you're like, you can be very well. Yeah, it's differently. It's like the paging happens way differently and everything. So you can be using a lot of memory for your process or for like system memory and not actually hit all the physical memory, or the opposite. So let's maybe ask this individual again see if we can get some more clarity onto this, and if there's a way that they can get what they need through like Node Exporter or a new metric. But Brendan, would you be able to get somebody who's more familiar with like the Windows Memory Manager to also comment?
Sure. Yeah, I had to think of who that would be, but yeah, definitely.
I tried to ping Paul, but I don't know if he saw this.
Paul and Eric are gonna have a really good idea.
That's
so
what I
that
was.
was my first go-to, but
Yeah, my take was that it's not wrong. It's just different than what was expected.
yeah, that's my take as well. So I think it would just be much more explicit for them to use something like Windows Exporter, because then they can get exactly what they want and doesn't require changing something that's pretty widely used.
Okay, I guess we'll try some stuff. I'll link to the recording too, so the individual can see some of the discussions and share some thoughts, and then we can progress from there. And it would be good if we could get Paul or somebody to also comment.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if Kublet's actually using this. As they said, they're actually scheduling containers when the node is already at capacity, and if this fixes that, that's, I think, a different.
If that's the case, then that's something that we want to.
So, okay. Cool.
Okay, next agenda item is something that I added. This is about, I know there's been a couple of people have asked about this, Arvind most recently in Slack. So for people unfamiliar with this, like normally when you start a Windows container, the volume that gets created for the container is 20 gigabytes. And with Docker that was configurable, you could use the Docker CLI to set like a storage ops and set a bigger size, or you could set it globally for the Docker in the Docker config. So you could have your nodes create Windows containers that where all Windows containers would create a larger node, or nodes. All of the containers on a node would be created with a larger volume size. With container D, the plumbing was done in container D to be able to set that, but there's no way to wire that into instruct Kubernetes to tell container D what size to make it. So this PR was an attempt to override one of the values, like the resource limit values, and SIG-Node didn't think that was a good idea. Most of the customers that have run into this issue were able to work around this by just switching their pods to use an empty dir volume instead of relying on that container, like the container's volume. But I'm wondering if we should just make a author a KEP and figure out how to expose this in the Kubernetes, like the deployment specs. I think we just need to figure out either pick a new API, like field in the API, and figure out where to put it and plumb that through. But then most of the work is going to be discussions around that. So does anybody have a strong opinion either way? If not, I'm inclined to try and do this, even if it doesn't happen for 127, but.
+1 for me.
And were you able to work around your issues by using empty dir?
So interestingly, my issue is not about larger size, but about smaller size.
Oh, okay.
Somebody, a customer wanted it to be less than 20 gig. That was the issue.
I believe that those volumes are all thin provisioned, so it won't actually allocate space until you use it. But
yeah,
if
that's what I observed.
Yeah, but if you are creating many pods and they're all thin provisioned, and then all of a sudden all of the containers in those pods want to write to the maximum of the volume size, that could run into issues. But you may be able to use the existing storage limits to.
So the internal OS API does the thin provisioning?
Yep. Yeah, somewhere in HCS or HCS shim, there's a default that says, give me, when you create the volume, that you unpack all of the contents of the container layers into, make it 20 gigabytes. And I think that was just what people thought was a reasonable size for a Windows Server core container image, which is not wrong. And since it was then provisioned, it doesn't necessarily, eat up that disk space. But
Yeah, the concerning bit is, right, things like, say someone is putting, I don't know, 200 pods on a node, and each of them gets this 20 gig virtual volume, right? As long as they're thin provision, you might get away with it. Nothing happens. But actually, when the pods start getting used, bad things start to happen on the node because you start to run out of space, especially if they are not aware of this and they have not given enough disk space for that node.
I believe that if you set up the eviction settings in the kubelet arguments, that the setting the resource, the ephemeral storage limits should help you prevent should be enforced and will evict pods that are using more than whatever the limits that are declared in the pod spec are, which can help prevent you getting from that. But I do think that there's a potential issue where you can run out of disk space.
I see. So you're saying that every pod spec should have the disk eviction policy set so that
Yeah, if people are concerned about storage space or the pods consuming a lot of storage.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
But either way, I think we've had enough asks for this that we should at least start drafting a cap. So, and now is a good time to do that. All right, that's all I had on that. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. All right, Jay, do you want to talk about the Windows Service Proxy?
Yeah, Ameem, I think you added the K2S stuff yesterday. So I just saw you pushed it last night. So that means the structure of this is now kind of up, and I see you're there. So if you just click on Windows Service Proxy, I'll just and I mean, if you want to jump in here, go for it. But it's pretty simple. There's a Windows backend directory, and that backend has the kernel space proxying stuff in it. That's not that different than if you were to go to PKG proxy Windows and look at the entry backend kernel space. And then if you pop out of there and you go to CMD, you'll see the thing that we use to run it. And then if you go into K2S, what we've done here is we made a couple of PRs into KPNG so that the original logic of KPNG was this idea of there's a kube to store functionality. And the idea there is you've got kube, you got a thing that watches the kube API server, and then that sees stuff, and then it pushes it into an in-memory, sort of data model, right? And then that can get pushed down to a store. And the store in this case, we're pushing it to the Windows backend now. And the way you do that is you literally say, to Windows kernel space backend, basically. It's compiled in. Now, what we've done here is we've lifted that code out of KPNG that defines the idea of watching the Kubernetes API and then pushing it to a specific backend, and we've sort of copied it in here. And this is a little bit of not the way you're meant to use KPNG, but from our perspective, we were thinking, well, this gives Windows complete control over anything. We can add our own command line options. We can add our own things that we want to push data to. We can basically do anything we want with this mechanism. The trade-off here is that we aren't exactly doing exactly the same thing that the other backends might do. Most of the backends people that were trying to extend KPNG with a new proxy would do something more like run the gRPC mode, and then they would just write their own backend. And the only thing the backend needed to know about was the KPNG gRPC. So there's no importing of the Kubernetes API. There's no importing of the Kubernetes client. There's no dependence on Kubernetes whatsoever. So it's something we can back out of this, but the decision we make here is it's a one-way door, right? So we go in and we do this and we own our own proxy forever, except for the core KPMG logic that we depend on that watches the API server and translates the data model for us. Not a lot of technical debt, a couple hundred lines of code, whatever, 300 lines of code, something like that. But we're importing stuff. We're adding imports here. That's the trade-off. We're now depending on the Kubernetes API. The trade-off on the other side is that we would be depending on gRPC, and the gRPC would now force us to run 2 processes. And the initial thought, I think, from the SIG was, let's not have 2 processes. Let's run everything in memory. Let's try to be similar to the existing proxy. So that's why we've gone with this road. But if y'all decide we'd rather not depend on the entire Kubernetes API and have a simpler, lighter footprint, and we're okay with that gRPC model, then we could back out of this and we could go back to, and I guess it's not really a 2-way door, 1-way door. I mean, we could back out at any time. But once we start adding a whole lot of custom logic to the way we get really opinionated with our command line options, that 1-way door, that 2-way door becomes much more like a one-way door.
So you mentioned that
Like
we could either run everything like this or depend on a gRPC interface. Is when the last I heard, which was probably like November, December, was that there was a desire to move KPMG itself away from that gRPC interface and define a Golang interface. And one of the implementations of that may be a gRPC thing. Is that still the case? Because if that's the case, we could probably just stick with what model we have here until that all gets fleshed out in the KPMG proper.
Yeah, there is this idea that you could have a normal, for most people that want to run everything in memory, you could just have a Golang interface and you implement that interface and then everything else is done for you. But even in that case, you would still be having to vendor in all of Kubernetes, because at the end of the day, if you're running everything in memory and you're watching the Kubernetes API, then you need client Go, and you can't get away from that. So even if they do build that interface, the way that you consume it might be cleaner and there may be more of a community around how you consume it, but you're still carrying the entire drama of depending on Kubernetes API. So there is an opportunity to not depend on the Kubernetes API, and that would be to use the gRPC stuff. But I don't think it makes a huge difference either way. I just wanted to make sure that everyone knows there's a trade-off here and there's no good answer to this problem. Go ahead.
This is the couple enough to later use the Capim original gRPC model, or even maintain both. That's a simple thing. The next thing I think it's fair to do is like bring the flags of the backend. I think we have a few hard-coded fields on it, and I will work to bring the current flags we have on the kubeproxy.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I think things like the source VIP and stuff were just hard coded in the KPMG proof of concept.
Yeah.
Oh.
You can blame that on.
Well, and the one we want to get rid of generally. So
yeah. So I think y'all can. I mean, I think this will be something we'll have instructions for testing and playing with it within a week or two. But the overall structure is basically there. So if folks want to look at it, you can. If you want to think about it, you can. It's probably a little premature to start filing bugs, but you could totally file issues against it or ideas or whatever,
I've got another question too, and it's maybe related to some other KEP work, especially if is Michael Zappa here? Oh no, not. So I noticed that the KPMG or the kubeproxy code in Kubernetes had some feature gates, which I've brought up in the past, which like enable or Windows DSR. And there was one other one that I had actually assumed were either beta or already graduated because I hadn't been touched since like 118. Mm-hmm. Do we want to worry about carrying forward that here, or do we just want to assume that it's Windows and DSR works and things like that?
Yeah, do folks care? I mean, I assume we would just want to put the latest functioning stuff in here and not worry too much about that and have versions.
Yeah.
We don't want the latest stuff, right?
I don't know the full history, especially because this wasn't captured in a KEP, but my understanding was like the DSR or the direct service return was mainly there because that was also being released with like developed in Windows, and they wanted to just be able to disable it or enable it based on the Windows OS patch level in case there were issues being introduced. But I don't have the full history of that. Does anybody not want to use like DSR mode, for example? And I believe Windows overlay was the other feature gate. And I know like pretty much all of the upstream SIG-Windows testing were using Calico with overlay networking mode. So
yeah, I mean, I don't know about behind a feature gate, but we definitely want that as a flag.
Yeah. I think before there was a feature gate to enable it and a flag to say which mode you're running in.
Yeah, track those. I mean, those are things to add as issues, right? Because we can add all the flags we want now. It's not hard. So you just say we want a flag for this, and we could we can put anything behind any flag we want, right? So yeah, definitely.
So all that, what you just talked about, Jay, about like the different trade-offs between having it in memory versus gRPC, did we write that down somewhere in here, like just a short paragraph that says like, we decided to do this because of XYZ?
I should, yeah, you're right. I made that document and we discussed it in the document, but we never discussed this in that document, right? So this is kind of a new thing that I'm just bringing up today. After sort of thinking about it, and I talked with some people about it. I talked to Mikhail some about it, and we're thinking about it, and we're like, well, when I told him I was, going to do this thing of copying the K2S over, and me and Amin were doing this, or Amin did it. I did got all this. We never, I don't think even me and Amin talked about it though. We did this all asynchronously. So I guess it's time like we should, I should just write this in that document. So we have, I will write it in the document, and then I'll repost the document in here. Should we move the Windows? Yeah. Should we move the Windows proxy out of tree? So
I just historically want to capture that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so that was old notes, and then I'm going to add new notes. So I'm going to add updates. So here's the document. I'm going to link it for folks in the SIG-Windows thingy. Where is SIG-Windows? Here it is. Yeah. So I'm going to relink it, and then I'm going to add it in there. And we'll just keep this as like a, oh God, what did I do? Here we go. Okay. There we go. Yeah. So I'm going to add that, and then I'm going to say 12. What is it? 1, 10, 2022. Decided to import K2S. This forces dependence on K8's API client Go, but gives us extreme flexibility. Right. So I'll just track the decisions at the top of that document, right, that we make along the way. 1/5/2022. Kubernetes SIG-Windows. Okay, cool. Yeah, good. Thanks for mentioning that one. Yeah, definitely want to track all these, because these decisions someday I'm sure someday we're gonna regret some non-trivial percentage of the decisions we make here.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Cool. Thanks. Great to see it coming along.
Yep.
Yeah. So this is a new project. So if anybody wants to own a piece of it or a part of it, for example, CI, or doing code reviews or anything like that, documentation, anything, like we definitely would love an owner for something here to help us along the way at some point. But we don't need anybody urgently, because right now we're just copy pasting code and moving stuff around, but within a few weeks, I'm sure.
Mhm.
You know, we have no CI, for example, and we have no concept of release management yet. So if anybody's interested in any of those areas, like, you know.
I think like one of the places that I think that we should rush to get to is to the point where this is running and building an image that we can use for like to deploy as a host process container in place of the kube proxy that we're running in the upstream CI tests, and just get a test signal with that. It may be completely off, but doing that too. And then after that, I think we'll have a good at least place to measure where things are, what's working, what isn't working if it's not working. And then that's when we can start to make decisions about when do we stop, you know, putting fixes in both kube proxy implementations. And then, but in parallel to that, I think there's a lot of opportunity for better unit test coverage or, you know, integration test coverage. And that is, I think, lacking in the in-tree implementation. So that would be a huge help.
Yeah. So we could, so that doesn't sound hard, right? Because I guess we could just add a make target for that. And so unless there's anything official that you're thinking needs to be done there, if it's just a matter of having a make target and a CI job that calls that make target, compiles the thing and uses it, that seems like something somebody could do with.
And we could even just like for some of the integration tests, I think one of the things that I've known just from looking into this, but Jay didn't mention here, is we have this cube to store. There's a mode for running KPNG, like, I don't know what it's called, a file to store, where you can just give it like a YAML representation of what all of the routes are supposed to be that it's supposed to program. Tell kubeproxy, go program this, and it'll use the same WinKernel backend, program everything in HNS, and then we can validate it too. So they can do a lot of more validation without a full-blown cluster.
Yeah, and then the only problem we run into there is like, what do we do for Windows virtual machines for CI? I don't know how.
Should be able to use the GitHub Windows VMs.
GitHub Windows VMs, so we could just make a VM using GitHub.
Yeah, just like their GitHub action
for the SIG node too. So you guys can keep talking, but I need to drop now. Thanks, everybody.
You don't need, and it can be Windows Server 2022. It'll make those for you.
Okay. Yeah, make 2022 and 2019. So, and I'm pretty sure we can program the proxy there. I mean, I could run host process containers in GitHub Actions. So should be good. Only thing we can't do in GitHub Actions right now is run like Hyper-V nested virtualization, but I don't think we need that for this project. So should be
okay. Cool. So that means that means we could make clusters, Kubernetes clusters using GitHub Actions.
No, because you don't have like multiple machines. You might be able to. There might be a way to hack around it, but yeah.
That's the tricky part, right? Because you can have the node, okay, but what about the rest of the things to create the cluster? You are struggling this for the SIG-Windows dev tools as well.
Well, yeah, so I think what Mark is saying is if we could just like, if all we're doing is programming the HNS rules, then, and we're not setting up all the containers and running kubelet and all those things, we're just making sure that the rules get written into HNS properly. We should be able to validate that as like an integration test prior to having to like, you know, run the whole suite and make sure everything works end to end type of thing.
Yeah. So we should integrate file to store somehow. So I'll add an issue to track that we need to integrate file to store somehow.
I think we can use Linux to run the unit tests, right? We don't need a Windows machine.
Well, he's talking about the HNS rules.
Yeah, unit tests we could probably do on Linux as long as it's not hitting unless you're not using some sort of Windows API or something. But the Linux, like to actually program HNS, you need a Windows machine for like an integration type of test.
Yeah, and then we can use that get, what is that, get HNS diag, right? As the test.
Yeah, and that
validate.
spits out JSON, and you could do some like a very detailed JSON about the state of the network, and so you could then validate that pretty extensively, which we aren't doing at all in the current Q proxy. So I think it could be a very beneficial.
Yeah, okay, I just filed that as the first issue. And then, yeah.
Cool. So we're at time. So is there anything else anybody wanted to discuss, or you can throw it on for the next meeting? Otherwise, want to make sure we end up respecting everybody's time.
That's all I got. I gotta go also. Cool. Thanks, Amin, for putting all this code in there last night.
Well,
Actually, I see Pramita and David are here, so I'll stay after hours and just introduce them. Pramita and David are both working on SIG-Windows DevTools stuff. And do you all want to say hi or anything?
Hi, myself Pramita, and I just started with working with Jay on integrating Chemo with the Vagrant. I found some of the issues. New to the community as well. I've worked on majorly on networking, storage also, but yeah, in the community, a newbie. Thank you.
And yeah, James, if you got to drop, that's okay. You can stop the recording and I'll.
Okay, cool. I'll stop everything now. It's nice to meet you. And I'll stop it now. Stop sharing.